Hi, I'm Hannah Brents, and this is the Theology Therapist YouTube channel. Welcome. I am a licensed independent clinical social worker and a registered yoga instructor with a private practice in Massachusetts. I have a bachelor's and master's degree in religious studies, and I know firsthand how toxic fundamentalist and cultic religious communities can be. So thanks for being here. Before we jump into today, remember to subscribe to the Theology Therapist YouTube channel and press the bell notification so you get up-to-dates on all weekly new releases. Lastly, if you find any of this helpful, I would love if you would leave a comment or share with a friend. So let's get started. So today I want to talk about boundaries after religious trauma. A couple of things about this. I actually really love talking about this because I think that it's so important. And I think a lot of the grief that we experience, not in like the grieving, but like the grief, like a lot of the slack that we get from the people in our lives happens, understandably, after beliefs change and can be mitigated to some extent with boundaries. So the first thing that I want to talk about is reality. The reality is that you are going to need boundaries if you've changed and your people haven't. You may have changed, and your people likely have not gone through that same process and come to the same change in beliefs that you have. This means that you may have some bumps along the way as you figure out how to be around each other. Your family gatherings and your holidays may look a little bit different now, or at least you may feel different about them. So that's the first thing, is to really recognize the reality of the situation, is that even though you feel so fundamentally different, your people have not changed. The second thing is to know where you stand. The first thing that you really have to get clear on, and I mean, this is hard to do shortly after or in the process of your beliefs changing, that I do want to make mention of that. It's hard to do in that moment because everything feels so grave. But it is so crucial to get clear on your boundaries. Where does the line stand for you about what you're okay with and what you are not okay with? To talk about, with whom, right? That might change some things. Are you willing, are you okay to have that conversation with your dad, but not with your aunt, ever? Are you willing to talk politics, but not religion? Are you willing to talk about so-and-so at church, but not theology? Get clear about where that line stands for you. It is most likely going to evolve as you do. If your line is here now, over time, that line is probably going to shift in some way. But it is important for the relational aspect, not necessarily for your theology per se, but for the relational aspect, to understand what you're willing to engage in. If you're okay, anything surrounding purity culture or kind of patriarchy, if anything about that is too much, it's too sensitive, it's too raw, then that's where the boundary is, right? That's where that has to lie. But if you're okay, I can hear about Vacation Bible School, or I can hear about Shabbat, or whatever. Know those things. The third thing that I think is really important to make mention of is understanding motives. Understanding the motives of the people in your life. When your people cross those boundaries, because that is going to happen, you're likely going to feel all kinds of ways about that. And you may not like what I'm about to say, but it can help to understand their motives. Are they trying to make things worse? Or are they operating from a place of what feels like love to them? And is it possible to keep these motives in mind when you are talking to them? You know what? I was in the middle of my process, and I was coming to terms with the fact that the Bible isn't exactly what they told me it was. I had a lot of had a lot of emotions about that. One of them was anger. And at the same time, you're like, when you have these realizations, it's like, oh my God, I have to tell somebody. Like, I need, everybody needs to know this stuff. Likely, they don't want to know, just FYI. So when I was in the middle of my process and realizing that the Bible wasn't what they told me it was, when I was coming to terms and learning like, oh, Peter didn't actually write 2 Peter, right? Like that's the low-hanging fruit. My mom didn't want to hear that. Like she was like not wanting to have that conversation because traditionally in Orthodox, it's like the Apostle Peter wrote Peter, right? Wasn't attributed to him. So, and my motives were coming from, you know, this place of like hurt and anger and like, oh my God, like somebody, and also just like, I don't know, kind of truth telling a little bit. I don't know if this happens to you, but like whenever they ask me, are you going to church this Sunday? Did you listen to the sermon? Whatever. Their motives aren't because they're like being judgy of me. If I'm really looking at it, like they're not trying to be judgy of me. They're doing that because that's important to them. It's important to them, and so to them it's beneficial, and so that's why it's like important to them to ask me if that is something that I participated in, right? It's not because they just think that I'm like a big old sinner. Maybe. So, motives. Is it possible to keep those motives in mind when you're talking to your people? I'm going to follow it up here with intention versus impact. So even if someone means well, you still need to check in with yourself to see how it's landing with you. If you think someone is nice, but spending time in their company leaves you feeling on edge or judged, then it's worthwhile considering whether this relationship is beneficial to you. So yes, like motives, like understanding someone's motives can be helpful, but then there comes a point when we just like kind of have to come to terms with intention versus impact. And like maybe their intention wasn't to be hurtful, but the impact of it is that it is. And so I think you have to kind of weigh the like how it's landing with you, and weigh the like really the relationship itself. Like, can this relationship sustain? Can it handle me having this conversation? Can the relationship hear the constructive feedback of this isn't landing the way that you likely intend, right? The impact of what you're saying is actually harmful, it's actually hurtful to me. Impact is actually a really important aspect of boundaries. Then we have creative compromise. Boundaries require compromise. And the thing to figure out is, can you engage your person in a creative compromise, in finding a creative solution to the tension that is created whenever somebody's beliefs change and they're no longer kind of synced up. A lot of times we think with boundaries, we think that like boundaries are for somebody else. Like, I have this boundary here, and so you need to respect that, or you need to change. And in my opinion, that's not what boundaries are at all. Boundaries are for you. Boundaries say, my boundary is here. If you cross it, then that means that I have to do something about this. I have to honor my boundaries. It's not that because you can't actually force somebody to like respect your boundaries. Like, you can't do that because they're an individual. And so a boundary is actually for you to honor. And the part of that honoring is trying to engage the other person in the creative compromise. So it doesn't mean that you have to go no contact immediately. Like, it doesn't mean that you have to say, you do this or I leave, or you leave, right? Can you find an alternative to stay in a relationship that feels good and authentic to both of you? So there are, like I said, it's creative. So there are a lot of different ways that this can look. But like, it was, one example is maybe like, if I feel like I can't talk about theology, like what I believe about God with my family. And we're talking on the phone, and the conversation ventures into those waters. I might say, hey, so remember, I don't actually feel like I don't actually want to talk about this right now, or I don't actually feel like I can have this conversation. So, I'd prefer if we change the subject. If they hear that and then they continue talking, I'm gonna reiterate that. I might say, hey, so I just want to reiterate, I know that this is important to you, but this isn't a conversation that I feel like I can engage in right now. What I did want to ask you though, ... I wanted to ask you how that dinner went with aunt and uncle, whoever, or how you guys liked your vacation to whatever, right? So that is a way of trying to maintain that relationship, trying to say oh, I still want to be in relationship with you. I still want to talk to you, but I don't I can't actually have this conversation. And then lastly, with boundaries, you got to stick to your guns. And there are going to be times when you have to make hard decisions, when people do not respect your boundaries and a compromise cannot be found. So that might be in my example of being on the phone. If they just continued, right? They just kept on, that might look like me saying, like I said, I can't have this conversation. So if the only way that you feel like you can talk right now is having this conversation, then I'm going to have to hang up. Right? It might be that, that's that sticking to your guns. It's trying to find that compromise by saying, I'd love to hear what you think about us trying this vacation, or how did you like that restaurant or whatever. But if that can't happen, then communicating, I actually can't be here now. Whenever you feel like you can talk about something else, then I'd love to chat, so give me a call, right? That's that trying to find a compromise, but honoring your boundary and sticking to it. If you have to decide to go no contact, this decision does not come lightly, and it's a really hard decision to make. Remind yourself that at this point, you have worked hard to make the relationship work. And at its current state, it is worse for your well-being. And so because of that, you need to go, right? Boundaries are huge. They're so individual, they're so unique, but they're so, so crucial, especially after religious trauma, especially if your beliefs have changed and your people's haven't. Hope this was helpful. Leave a comment below. Let me know about how this has gone for you before, or if there's something here that you haven't thought about. And share with a friend who might need to know more about how to have boundaries after beliefs have changed. Okay, I hope you have a great week. Thanks for being here. I'll see you next week.